Good morning, Theories of Leadership class. It's week 3, and we've made a huge jump from the first week where we looked at leadership and followership in terms of antiquity, particularly Plato and Aristotle. Week 2, we jumped into the Middle Ages, looked at Augustine and Aquinas and their important views. And of course, Augustine and Aquinas deeply influence our thoughts about leading and following through the Christian church, obviously. And so here we are in week 4, the Renaissance. We've moved to the 14th century through the 16th centuries. And I know it would have been nice to spend more time in the Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, which were actually not very dark at all, except from the perspective of the Vandals, the Goths, the Visigoths, etc., overrunning large swaths of Europe. We saw how the Irish, according to Thomas Cahill, saved civilization by holding on to the works of antiquity and copying and recopying them for future generations. But what's also really interesting is the Italian city-states, Milan, Florence, Venice, etc., remained relatively independent through the Middle Ages and into the 1300s because no so-called barbarian chief had managed to overrun them, as, for example, Clovis had done in Gaul, and other tribes had done throughout Europe. Barbarian comes from the Greek barbaros, and it simply means, well, in common parlance, country bumpkins. These were people who were, according to the civilized Christians, were actually not civilized in the sense that they were not educated and they had not been converted to Christianity. So the focus is on the city-state of Florence, and that was where Machiavelli lived, and he died on his estate outside the city. But all of his activities were done within the context of Florence and also within the context of Italy and the other Italian city-states. In 1348, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, killed off probably 1/3 of Italy's population and turned city-state against city-state. Milan in the north was particularly notorious for attacking other northern city-states under the Visconti family, the most notorious of whom was Gian Galeazzo. And I'll be using material from Arthur Herman's The Cave and the Light, Plato versus Aristotle, and the struggle for the soul of Western civilization. Herman notes, in 1385, Gian Galeazzo overthrew and murdered his uncle. Then 5 years later, decided to take control of all of northern Italy. By 1395, Florence, in Italian Firenze, was the only remaining free city-state in Italy besides Venice. But Venice had signed a non-aggression pact with Galeazzo, and this character was portraying himself as the new Caesar, and he was in the process of creating a new Rome. Florence's city manager, Coluccio Salutati, pulled out, yes, Aristotle's politics and his ethics, and reminded himself that freedom was essential for the good life, which involved 2 critical insights. First, humans must not be coerced or held in bondage, but must be substantively free. Second, the highest good for any human being was participation in the civic and economic life of a city-state or a country as a free person. On 10th of August, 1402, Galeazzo and his troops surrounded Florence and was ready to mount a siege, but he died suddenly. His army dissolved, his so-called kingdom fell apart, and Florence was saved. To the Florentines, this was a divine miracle. Herman again. The result was a sudden upsurge of confidence and energy in all aspects of Florentine life. That same year, Filippo Brunelleschi and his friend Donatello went to Rome to study the beauties of classical architecture and sculpture. Upon his return, Brunelleschi began his work on his great dome for Florence's cathedral, Il Duomo. And in 1403, Lorenzo Ghiberti started casting the great bronze doors for the baptistry of Il Duomo, and so on and so forth. Painters, beginning with Masaccio, began painting from a one-point perspective, which introduced realism in paintings. And you can see this also in Raphael's School of Athens, which I ask you to take a look at because, again, it connects Plato and Aristotle with all of the great thinkers in Western civilization. Herman writes, all this creative outflow, the product of a post-1402 generation of Florentines eager to celebrate the political liberty and its unleashing of human potential, we call the Renaissance. Thanks to the Florentines' reading of Aristotle, a new way of seeing the world had been born, and with it, a new appreciation of civil and civic freedom. But most important, this sense of freedom was perceived to be a universal human value transcending all local traditions and historical contexts. It was precisely this sense of freedom as an essential part of human nature and potentiality that the Florentines had discovered in Aristotle and passed on to subsequent generations. Herman, page 268. Christianity still mattered, but the Florentines insisted the study of secular history, rhetoric, literature, and ethics, which Leonardo Bruni first described as studia humanitatis, the study of humanity, or what we know as the humanities, was critical. This new liberty, this new sense of freedom, in the arts and literature and history and languages was really heady wine, right? But alas, it did not last. Bruni died in 1444, and by that time, a merchant turned banker, Cosimo de' Medici, had secretly been controlling the city for almost a decade. By the way, there is a 2016 Netflix series, which is excellent, entitled Medici, if you really want to get a full background of what's going on here in Florence in the 15th century. From 1434 through 1492, which marked the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and of course, that's when Cristobal Colombo also sailed the ocean blue, the Medici family, for all those years, ruled Florence. The big question was why Florence had sacrificed its freedom to this wealthy family. If we flash forward to the 23rd of May, 1498, we'll see three men being shuffled to the gallows, built over stacks of wood in Florence's center. Girolamo Savonarola and two others have been found guilty of treason and blasphemy. Savonarola, a popular Benedictine priest, had rewritten the constitution of Florence and created what was later called a bonfire of the vanities, where Florentines burned their decadent clothing, perfumes, book, and furniture in order to lead a more pure Christian life. Savonarola had attempted to consolidate power through an alliance with France, but the Spanish Pope, Alexander VI, who was actually a Borgia, and there's another Netflix series that was produced in 2013 entitled The Borgias, which you might want to watch after you watch the Netflix series on the Medicis. Pope Alexander VI, a Borgia, put sanctions against Florence in place, which caused the merchants to rise up against this Benedictine priest, Savonarola. And this is where Machiavelli enters the picture. Niccolo Machiavelli, then 29 years old, watched the three men hang and then burn to death. And with that, the idea of freedom and civic virtue went up with the smoke. Machiavelli had never known a time when the Medici family didn't rule Florence. The brief Christian democratic republic of Savonarola had failed, but Machiavelli, again turning to Aristotle, found something interesting: the idea of what we now call the citizen soldier, who would defend his state and home to the death. Remember, we're living in a period of warring city-states in Italy. From 1506 to 1512, Machiavelli raised up and trained an army of citizens to defend Florence. The Spanish returned in 1512, laid siege to the city, and Machiavelli's 3,000 soldiers bested themselves. I mean, they did really well in the first battle, but eventually they fled before the professional Spanish soldiers. Machiavelli was imprisoned and tortured. He underwent 6 rounds of strappado, but he gave up no names. Strappado was a unique torture where the person was hung up by their shoulders underneath their armpits and then dropped. Usually after 1 or 2 drops, people would confess to whatever the inquisitors were requiring. Machiavelli withstood this strappado torture 6 times, and he still didn't capitulate. He still didn't give out any names of the people who had been involved in his plot. But he was left to rot in prison, and then suddenly, apropos of nothing, he was released. He returned to his farm outside Florence to read and ponder the catastrophic events of his life. He concluded that freedom simply did not work, because once a state became wealthy, the citizens became lax and could be easily overpowered by an ambitious prince. So why not simply start with a powerful prince who is also a ruthless ruler in order to keep the people in line? In short, freedom is overvalued, and freedom is not practical. This kind of freedom simply doesn't work. We don't have philosopher kings here a la Plato, or enlightened aristocrats a la Aristotle, or Christianized monarchs, as in Aquinas, or Christian princes who are lovingly tended to by their wives, the Pison. No. What we have is Machiavelli uncovering the final paradox of liberty or freedom in Aristotle's model. Herman again. Aristotle's politics is built on the back of his ethics. The good life presupposes the virtuous life. However, in order to survive, free societies sometimes have to violate the very values they profess to uphold. They have to wage war and kill innocents. They have to imprison enemies and sometimes torture them. In extreme situations, they have to suspend civil liberties, even shut down traditional institutions, all to prevent something worse. And history, Machiavelli thought, and you'll see this in the discourses on Livy, validates this. The Romans became ruthless, but were still overthrown by even more ruthless barbarians. The Medicis and the Borgias were also ruthless, but they succeeded, at least in Machiavelli's life. Okay, so this is the historical context for Machiavelli's The Prince and the discourses on Livy. At this point, I would stop and ask you if there are any questions, but since this is asynchronous, that is not going to happen. So what I'd like to do is just turn to the two readings, one from the Prince and the other from Machiavelli's Discourse on Livy. And the first reading, the Prince, a short reading from the Prince, is found on page 85 of your textbook. And really, what's going on here? Machiavelli is taking on this whole tradition that's rooted in antiquity and brought up to date and Christianized through Augustine and Aquinas. And he says, I thought it better to treat this subject as it really is, in fact, than to amuse the imagination with visionary models of republics and governments that have never existed. That's a clear shot at Plato's Republic, right? Don't create these imaginary castles in the sky that simply cannot be inhabited. Let's get down to being real. Let's get really practical about how to rule. And he argues a prince who wishes, this is at the end of the first paragraph, to maintain his power ought therefore to learn that he should not always be good, and must use that knowledge as circumstances and the exigencies of his own affairs may seem to require. This is a profound and a disconcerting statement. A prince who wants to maintain power has to learn that he should not always be good. And what have we gotten so far from our readings in this course? There's a running theme, a running argument that in order for somebody to become a good supervisor or manager, a leader, this person must be a good person. This person must aspire to be ethically sound, to have moral integrity. And here, in one sentence, Machiavelli undercuts 1,500 years of, even more than that, almost 1,800 years of discussion about the character traits and the character qualities and the idea that a leader ought to be a great person, whether a man or a woman. So that's the opening for the Prince, and the argument runs that the qualities, the characteristics of the Prince need to appear to be good, but the Prince himself does not necessarily need to be good. And one of my favorite sections is on page 87, and the question of whether or not it is better to be loved than feared as a ruler, as a manager, or a supervisor. And you can imagine, and you've already read it probably, but you can imagine what Machiavelli would say. It's much better to be feared than to be loved. But he goes on to say that you also don't want to exacerbate your people by overtaxing them, by burdening them with things that they cannot manage. You don't want to be hated, but you do want to be feared, because the fear of the ruler, he believes, is what keep people in line. So I'll let you plow through this. It's really an amazingly important document for the history of leadership and for contemporary views of leadership. And I think you'll find it interesting. But the bottom line is that appearance is everything. One has to appear to be good, appear to be virtuous. But it stops there, because there are times when the Prince needs to lower the boom and take people out, sometimes torture them, sometimes kill them, so that the critical thing is for the leader to be feared rather than loved. but not to be hated or despised. So let's turn to the discourse on Livy, and you'll notice in our textbook that this is the first selection in this textbook on followers. Livy was a Roman historian, probably lived until 12 or 17, what used to be called AD, but now CE, who was born in the 7th century BCE. He wrote an important history of Rome from the early myths through the reign of Augustus during the time of Christ. He was friends with Augustus, and he knew the future Emperor Claudius as well when Claudius was a boy. So I've suggested that you need to find the thesis in here, and I think the thesis is pretty clear to find. His basic argument is that the people, the unwashed masses, yes, the uneducated masses, the holy polloi, tend to be superior to the prince in virtue. In other words, all of us who are part of this massive people who are being led by better educated, sometimes, people in terms of our political system, our sensibilities as people, our virtues are stronger and deeper than our rulers. And of course, I'll let you find that actual thesis and think about it. But that's pretty important insight, even for today. You know, as we see our leaders, our political leaders, and others falling down morally in some serious ways, corruption and corruption and fear and an inability to care about other human beings seems to be endemic in the United States here. And we're all aware of the culture wars that escalated under President Trump, it seems to me, into political and economic wars. And here in the midst of a pandemic with people dying, there are still these battles going on over whether or not to wear a mask, right? Whether or not to get a vaccine in the first place. And because of this ongoing debate, even though the numbers are falling, right, for the pandemic, we're still running at about 1,000 deaths per day here in the U.S. and 60 to 70,000 new cases. So we're not out of the woods on this. We've got economic troubles, we've got health troubles, and we certainly have political troubles. And we are, I think, in search of leaders who have integrity and are transparent and are at least seemingly good people. But Machiavelli says all one needs to do is appear to be good. So enjoy the readings for this week, and I look forward to the discussion and what you have to say. I'm enjoying your thoughts, your summary and response writings, both in the discussions and the webliographies, or I guess they're called journals in this class. I'm going to now share my screen and go to this week. I'm going to share a window. Let's see if this works. And then I'm going to go over to the Renaissance and Reformation. Actually, this week, the Renaissance. This is week 3, and here's the overview. I've given you a much more lengthy introduction to the Renaissance. You're going to read these 2 chapters in traditional classics on leadership, both by Machiavelli. I've given you a Renaissance timeline below and a theories of leadership handout. And I also want you to take a look at Raphael's The School of Athens, painted between 1508 and 1513, right around the time that Machiavelli was writing, to get a feel for the rebirth of painting, architecture, philosophy, and history. So I'll let you take a look at that. And you're going to give me a journal update, leadership research. And here I ask you to share the research you've done so far on the leader you are researching this semester. Briefly summarize 3 articles you have read and think about how you might want to frame this paper in terms of the 7 leadership theories discussed in the leadership theories handout or some other approach to leadership. Is this person a charismatic leader, a transformational leader, or a transactional leader? Would it be useful to discuss this person's traits or characteristics which have made them a good or bad leader? You are simply gathering information at this point, what in rhetoric we call invention, getting as much information as you can in order to move to the next rhetorical step, which is arrangement, dispositio, where you will begin to organize the material into some kind of outline. So that's the journal for this week. I give you a Renaissance and Reformation timeline. I just find this kind of thing to be useful, right? This is the Renaissance, 1453. It's really the Renaissance and Reformation through 1650. You can see here at the head, Gutenberg's invention of the printing press, which was an absolutely critical phenomenon for the spread of ideas, because now one can mass produce books, one can mass produce the Bible, the Quran, and so on and so forth. I won't go over much of this. 1492, we have the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia is reigning at the time. And we have Da Vinci's Last Supper, the execution of Savonarola, Pope Julius II, patron of Michelangelo, is ruling from 1503 to 1513. Michelangelo's statue David, Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, the coronation of King Henry VIII. And we really have the beginning here of the Reformation. Desiderius Erasmus's Praise of Folly, which was written in 1509 and published in 1511. And here you have Machiavelli's The Prince and the Discourses on Livy. I just find these timelines to be helpful, and we'll return to it, to the timeline next week when we move into the Reformation. So here's the discussion. After you read Machiavelli's short essays, present an idea about leadership drawn from these selections, and write me a good summary response. That is, I think I say 4 to 6 sentences in a summary, maybe even more, where you capture some main idea that's being developed by Machiavelli, and call that your summary, right? And make sure that you properly document your sources. And I've given you a APA 7th edition template in the Start Here button, which I'll show you in a moment. But do that summary response writing for your initial posts in the discussion, but also in the journals. It's just a really useful way of writing, because what you do in graduate school, right? You have to summarize things, but then you also have to respond to them. You have to interpret them. You have to apply them to today. And one of the beauties of studying the history and the theories of leadership is that that so much that seems old and forgotten turns out to be incredibly relevant for today's discussions about leadership. And then there's this handout, Contemporary Theories of Leadership. If you click on that, you can upload it. And here it is. These 7, and there are more, but the great man theory, which we have talked about, the trait theory, which we have talked about. But then you're introduced here in this handout to behavioral theories, contingency theories, charismatic leadership theory, transactional leadership theory, and transformational leadership theory. And I didn't give you quite enough information about how to cite this properly, so I took care of that here at the bottom. So take a look at that. And that's basically what we're doing this week. And I'll be responding to your initial posts for the discussion, and we'll talk to you soon.